Welcome to another edition of Church and State with Chris Ferrara and Brian McCall. Welcome back to the Soviet Socialist Republic of America, is what it seemed to be turning into here.
Yeah, after 3 weeks in Italy, seeing what's going on in this country, I really didn't want to come back. So, I mean,
Well, we need. We,
the lunatics are not only running the asylum; they're burning it to the ground.
very true. Well, as we record this show, the infamous Corrupt World Youth Day has launched in Lisbon this year. It started August 1st this year. And I actually searched for images sort of promoting World Youth Day. And I just want to show them because I don't know if you've noticed, I noticed with the Synod and these other things, all of the Vatican. Um, whatever PR. I think they hired somebody from Sesame Street because almost everything they put out looks like it came from Sesame
Oh
Street.
yeah,
So like the Synod thing. So I want to show here are again, I just did a random search for images related to World Youth Day. And I mean, look at them. They all look like little Sesame Street drawings. And you can see these are from the Vatican, from various dioceses. They're all using the same basic imagery.
yeah. Well, this is a sign of a descent into a state of terminal infantilism. Uh,
Well, and it's kind of the irony. It's sort of the we want to be hip church for the 1960s. I mean, if you were a 17-year-old, would this little picture like right here appeal to you?
Well,
Like
this tells us about the mentality of the people who are orchestrating these events. We're dealing with basically it's the same thing in politics, by the way. Basically, children wielding power within power structures. Psychologically, these people are just undeveloped emotionally. They don't have integrated personalities. I think the appropriate term is psychosexual infantilism is at work here. We see this with people like James Martin, for example. And so much of what's coming out of the Vatican has the tenor of let us just say limp-wristed commentary on this or that subject.
Well, interesting. I took a look over the agenda for Corrupt World Youth Day that is happening in Portugal. Portugal still, again, at least culturally, what people say they are, one of the most Catholic countries in the world. 85 between 85 and 90% of Portuguese people say that they are Catholic. So not a place where there's lots of other Christian, false churches or other religions going around, but the whole thing is like ecumenia. They're going to have visits to mosques and Buddhist temples and Hindu shrines, and they're inviting Protestant groups for the youth to go meet. There actually were very few events listed that it's not anything to do with our Lord Jesus Christ and more to do with like ecumenical dialogue.
Well, this is exactly why Pius XI in Mortalium Animos forbade any participation in the nascent ecumenical movement, which emerged from the Protestant sects. As he warned in that document, it this idea of the ecumenical movement promotes the error that all religions are more or less good and praiseworthy because they all
Mm.
reflect the inner religious sense of man. This inner religious sense, of course, is this basic modernist notion that everybody's more or less a kind of a Christian, the anonymous Christian. Everybody really is a member of the church in one way or another. It's just a matter of concentric circles, and the outer circle is still part of the mystical body in some obscure way. And as he warned, this movement would result not only in this idea of indifferentism, all religions are more or less good and praiseworthy, but a total abandonment of the revealed religion itself.
Hmm.
Revelation is no longer of any account to the current Vatican, what Christ has revealed, in particular about the Decalogue and our obligation to obey it, which he enhances in ways that were considered novel by the Pharisees, but were always true. For example, if you lust after another woman in your heart, you have already committed adultery. So he called us to the higher standard of moral rectitude made possible by the influence of sanctifying grace. We don't hear about that anymore either, do we?
Well, I'm sure Father James Martin, who was invited, will be talking about that since he's so supportive of the sixth and ninth commandment. Well, and again, this just isn't, our evaluation of this mess of World Youth Day. I want to read you what Bishop Strickland, who is for at least for the moment, the bishop of Tyler, Texas,
Yeah, for the
said
moment, right?
about, for the moment, said about World Youth Day. Quote, what a tragedy that World Youth Day has fallen prey to the current trend to secularize the Catholic Church and de emphasize Jesus Christ. No wonder it will have the lowest attendance since John Paul II first began WYD in 1986. It was a beautiful moment of evangelization. Now, yeah, I'll pause there. As you and I have been saying for decades, the World Youth Day under John Paul II wasn't some panacea of orthodoxy. I mean, it was basically a pop concert with some religious things thrown in, a demagogic experience, and with a lot of liturgical abuse. But that aside, again, maybe Bishop Strickland couldn't see that under John Paul II, but at least he's waking up now to see that this is not anything helpful towards spreading the faith among young people.
Well, the idea is to basically negate the missionary activity of the church. Someone has said that the church has been demissionized since the Second Vatican Council. Why bother being a Catholic? I mean, I'm okay, you're okay, your religion is just fine. Let's go visit the mosque. So,
Right.
with that message of indifferentism comes the de facto end of the church's missionary activity. And what is the result in society since we talk about church and state? I'm thinking of the great counter revolutionary thinker, uh, Juan Donoso Cortez of the 19th century. And in one of his works, he said that what happens when the Catholic faith recedes as a social influence is that all of society returns to the condition of the pagan world. And now we're
Mm.
seeing things that even Caligula would be horrified by. So it's a form of paganism that defies belief, where people are told that they can surgically mutilate themselves and become the opposite sex. You get men in women's locker rooms. The insanities go on and on and on. And we've seen things at this stage of social decomposition that I think are unprecedented in the entire history of salvation.
I'd say the history of civilization
Yeah, yeah.
as well. Yes. Well, interestingly, on the same day that Bishop Strickland's tweeted that about the problem with World Youth Day, on the positive side, he had this to say, which was really interesting. He said, Christ is the vine. The traditional Latin Mass is rooted in the vine, robust with truth, and bears much fruit. Any attempt to sever the traditional Mass from the church is an attack on the unbroken link to tradition, as received from the apostles, and an attack on the deposit of faith. Those is fighting words, I would say. I mean,
He hasn't got long for his Episcopal see. As you mentioned in the
yeah,
pre-show discussion,
yeah.
the visitation that was hastily arranged has already been completed. I'm sure there's a negative report, and he'll soon be removed from his Episcopal see. That's what happens under this current dictatorship, the papal dictatorship of the party boss, who was the current occupant of the chair of Peter.
Right, right.
So we're seeing in the church, as in civil society, a rapid acceleration of what Cardinal Ratzinger called the process of decay that began after the Second Vatican Council. It's reaching its final stage. That's bad news, and it's also good news because when you reach these terminal stages of things, you reach what the historians call a climacteric, a turning
Mm,
point in history, when history goes in the other direction. That has to happen sooner or later. The only issue is what the context of that reversal will be. How much of humanity will be left?
right.
Will there be a nuclear war, which the idiot who's occupying the White House right now, that senile old crook, seems to be determined to provoke with the advice of his moronic advisors, whose every foreign policy adventure has been a complete debacle.
Mm. Absolutely true. Well, and absolutely right. As you refer to, just last month, it was announced that Vatican visitation teams swept in to investigate Bishop of Tyler, uh, which is one of the most flourishing in a Vatican post Vatican II sense. I mean, still nothing like before the council, but dioceses with seminarians and ordinations
Mhm.
and Eucharistic adoration and mass attendance,
Can't have that.
swooped in to investigate. Why? Because there's, charges of abuse or corruption? No, supposedly to investigate his social media posts. Well, with posts like these that we just read, you can see why they're worried. He's made the connection. He sees the bad, but he sees the solution. And this is a bishop who only really just about 2 years ago found the traditional Latin Mass, had someone teach him to say it, now is saying it pretty regularly as his private Mass, and said that it has transformed his priesthood. Now, again,
That's
can't have
remarkable. I
that.
wasn't aware of that. That's quite remarkable.
Oh yeah, he's given an interview. It said it totally transformed his priesthood to have found the traditional Latin Mass, and of course, who's he referring to? Wanting to sever the Mass from the vine? Well, clearly, uh, Cardinal Roche and Francis, who are, you know standing there on the limb trying to saw the vine off from the tree since 2021, out in the open,
So
and
he was basically investigated for suspicion of orthodoxy, is what you're telling me.
right.
So and
Eh,
so what we see in the church is eerily analogous to what we see in civil society, which is the attempt to censor disinformation, meaning, of course, the truth.
yes.
So, so the only people who are punished in civil society today by the authorities are those who tell the truth. The same thing is happening in the church. As the church goes, so goes the state. I mean, the whole theme here on this show is the parallels between developments in the church and developments in the state. And we see both hurtling toward disaster on parallel tracks. It's quite remarkable.
It is. It's ironic at the time when the world proclaims the greatest, quote, separation of church and state. There's never been more, I think, time in history where the church has been on the same page as the state. It's sort of essentially, I think Archbishop Vigano talks about the Vatican acting as like the church bureau of the deep state.
Funny you should say that because there's a book by Kenneth Craycraft, Craycraft,
Hmm,
The American Myth of Religious Freedom, in which he says not only is there no separation of church and state, there's been a total unification of the two for
yes.
practical purposes. We're talking, of course, about the human element of the church, which has
Yes.
become a
Yes.
cooperating arm of the secular state, whose priorities have been locking people down and getting them vaccinated, as the civil authorities demand. This was Francis's big agenda. It's an act of love to get yourself vaccinated with useless vaccines and to close the churches and lock yourself into your home, which accomplished absolutely nothing, of course,
Mhm.
except the aims of the globalists, which would be to condition people to total control from the top. That's what that was all about.
And again, before jet setting off to Lisbon
Of
to,
course, they're never bound by their own rules.
right, of course. But again, he proved that before jetting off to Lisbon to, party with the youth at the mosque, Francis granted a private audience to the head of the World Health
Of
Organization.
course.
Yes, right.
And once
Uh,
again, we reveal our expertise as masters of the obvious.
exactly. Unveiling the out in the open things that are going on. Exactly. Well, but as you said, the parallel is remarkable because here a bishop who actually wants to be a bishop and try to restore some semblance of order in the church gets investigated. And likewise, if we switch over to the state, it was announced
No,
just the day before we record this show that the another one of the henchmen, the Himmler to the Biden administration, uh, yet again indicted former President Donald Trump. So Tuesday, there must be another Trump indictment going on. Uh, Again, on new charges that he engaged in a conspiracy to deny the federal government its process.
yeah, well, actually, it was a conspiracy to promote opinions and legal theories with which Jack Smith disagrees. This is the
So it
most
was a conspiracy to exercise First Amendment rights. Is
this
that,
this
have I got
indictment
that right?
this indictment is basically a recitation of numerous First Amendment protected activities ginned up into a conspiracy to defraud the United States. From the very first line of this ridiculous document, we read the following: the defendants spread lies that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the election that he had actually won. Oh my goodness. You mean he denied the outcome of an election like every Democrat has done since 2000 regarding every presidential election they lost? And then the rest of this document is all about false claims, fraudulent slates of electors, meaning alternate electors in case they prevailed in an election challenge, which is something that was done during the Kennedy election in 1960.
Mm,
Telling people to do things that they didn't do, advising theories provided by his attorneys that these theories be followed when they weren't actually followed, and then ultimately he just left office when he was supposed to leave office. So what's it all about? It's about trying to criminalize someone who thought that he had been cheated out of re-election. Who doesn't think that there was a massive potential for fraud when in so many of the swing states the election procedures were changed by executive fiat rather than by the state legislatures, when there were millions and millions of mail-in ballots with feeble or non-existent chain of custody evidence, when signatures were hardly, if at all, verified, when ballot boxes were stuffed, the ballot drop boxes that suddenly sprouted in many states, and there's videos of that. Anyone with any sense, and the vast majority of Republican voters, knows that there was mischief during this election. And by the way, if you look at the swing states, let's see, it was Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, and
Michigan.
Pennsylvania. The spread of votes in those states that would have resulted in, at the very least, a tie in the Electoral College over those four states, 44,000 votes would have
Mm,
made the difference. There would have been a tie in the Electoral College. So we're supposed to believe that with millions and millions of mail-in ballots floating around, ballot drop box stuffing by ballot harvesters in places where it happened to be a felony to do that, we're supposed to believe that every one of those votes was accurately counted and there's no discrepancy of 44,000 votes out of 81 million cast. Please. So Smith's entire indictment depends upon him having to prove that the election was totally on the up and up in every one of the states. He goes through each of the swing states, by the way. There's a
mm,
subdivision for in
yes.
the indictment for, oh, Trump said the result in Michigan was rigged. Oh, he said the result in Pennsylvania was rigged. Oh, he said the result in Wisconsin was rigged. Oh, he said the result in Georgia was rigged. So what is the evidence at trial going to be? They're going to bring in election experts to say, oh no, this was a totally fair election. And not one of the 44,000 votes that determined the outcome here was illegally cast. This is preposterous. I can't believe
Well,
it's happening.
do you notice how they've shifted the narrative? They're very clever about this. It's kind of like all the COVID stuff. They say one thing when they're sort of found that they can't support that, they shift it. So
Right.
back in 2020 into 2021, their statement was there was absolutely no fraud, zero fraud, the safest election in history, no fraud, no fraud, no fraud. Now, note what you just read. Now they've shifted to okay, there was fraud, but it was not outcome
What?
determinative.
Not
It was
determinative.
yeah,
Yeah. We
it was a
know.
little bit of yeah.
Yeah, we know. We've looked at every one of those 80 million
Right,
votes,
right,
including those 44,000 votes, and every single one of
right.
of the votes in that razor thin margin that would have led to a tie in the electoral college. Every one of those votes was legally cast.
Yeah.
There's no reason to worry about anything with
Hey,
millions.
what's a little fraud among
That's a
friends?
little
Come on.
fraud among 81 million votes. Come on. So this is what the indictment is about. Trump challenged the election. Trump wanted to pursue untested theories. Trump asked Vice President, the Vice Vice President Pence to exercise authority according to a theory that his lawyers had advised him was viable to send the matter back to the states where the elections were being contested. Yeah, and Trump didn't. Pence didn't do it, and he sent a letter advising the deputy attorney general to do thus and so. Various things he suggested be done that weren't done. So basically, it was an exercise of First Amendment expression, seeking alternatives to
Mm,
prevent what was obviously, in the minds of many Americans, this one included, a dubious election at best.
mm. Well, a couple things about this guy I've looked at and get your legal thoughts here. Some of the things there are you some of it is First Amendment expression, which I love. They say, "Oh, everyone's free to challenge an election, except if you're Donald Trump." But some of it is related to legal advice that he received from attorneys. So, I mean, that seemed a really dangerous precedent. If you can sue someone and basically, I mean, are you gonna force his attorneys to disclose privileged conversations that his attorneys had with him? Is that,
Well,
I mean, that's where it seemed to
we
be
have the
going.
list of the co-conspirators that was leaked as
And they're all attorneys, it seems like most of them, except for one, I think, are
one was a
attorneys,
security advisor, I forget, a Defense Department official, or
right?
rather, a
Yeah.
Department of State official.
Justice, right,
Yeah, but they were all most of them were attorneys. So basically, Trump is being indicted because he received advice from his attorneys that Jack Smith disagrees with.
right,
So there's going to be an attempt to criminalize legal theories that are considered frivolous by the prosecutor. And the idea is, one person suggested to me, the theory is, well, this was sham litigation. Litigation brought to overturn these election results was sham litigation. Well, first of all, sham litigation is not a criminal offense. The worst thing
right.
that can happen to a sham litigator is he gets a Rule 11 sanction and he has to pay attorney's fees. It's not a crime. And it wasn't
Right.
sham litigation. If you look at some of the presentations they made, they were pretty darn compelling. And the only reason they didn't get to court in the vast majority of cases was supposed lack of standing, which is a threshold question. The merits were never reached.
Well, that's the other shifty thing they do. They say this election was not outcome determinative because look at all these courts that looked into it and found no problem. Again, it's not being honest. Not a single one of those cases was actually tried on the merits.
No, they had no trial.
They
No.
they were all thrown out in a day or 2 on things like standing and, rightness and basically, we're not gonna look at the evidence, we're just gonna throw this out. But again, if you just say every court threw it out, it makes it sound like the court investigated every ballot and found them legitimate, which not a single one did.
Well, the problem with what happened during the 2020 election is there are so many different ways, given the new procedures that they imposed, to cheat that proof would be a veritable impossibility. If you have millions of mail-in ballots, if you have ballot harvesting, people running around collecting ballots from people in nursing homes, for example, and then stuffing them into ballot boxes, it doesn't take long to add up to the decisive razor-thin margin here. But how are you going
Mhm.
to prove that if it's done in 100 different ways? And so they played this perfectly with their changes in the election procedures. And now, at least half of the country no longer has confidence in the outcome of a presidential election unless we revert to the old tried and true method, which has been restored in Europe, of paper ballots and personal appearances to certify your identity
Right.
by presenting identification, which you have to do for everything in this country, including getting on an airplane or buying liquor, but not to vote,
Right.
apparently. Why?
Right.
Because if you prevent people from having to identify themselves in the voting booth, you can cheat. That's the whole
Right.
purpose of opposing voter identification. So when you strip voter identification out of the electoral process and replace it with mail-in ballots in the millions, who isn't going to lack confidence in the
Mm.
outcome of an election? How will we ever know, especially in razor-thin margin cases, whether the votes were accurately counted in every single case? We'll never know again.
Well, it's more than accurately counted, accurately cast. I mean,
Accurately cast.
maybe they counted them correctly, but if you're counting things that are not real.
We had two
Now, one of
problems.
the things.
Yeah, yeah. Who
Yeah,
cast the
yeah,
ballots? But then
right.
I forget the dictum who uttered the dictum of a communist.
It was
And
Stalin, I think. He who counts the
yeah, yeah.
votes
It isn't what
determines
so
the.
much who
Yeah,
casts the votes, but who counts them.
who counts them,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, I mean, you could just if you want to take votes from a certain county known to be a red county, you just start rejecting them. Oh, that signature
Right.
doesn't match. That doesn't match.
Yep.
We take them and throw them in the garbage. Maybe 150 people each threw out 100 ballots in one
Right.
county, and then you multiply that by hundreds of counties. So again, the process has become so porous, so fraught with the possibility of error, that unless we get back to a sound procedure in counting votes in an election, Americans, at least half of them, the Republicans and most independents, are not going to have confidence any longer in the outcome of
Right.
presidential elections. We no longer have an election day. Remember election day? You knew the night of who the president was. Now it's weeks afterwards.
Well, and weeks before.
A week before.
Yeah. Well, and again, I read again, like I said, he goes through state by state, and the one that really struck me was the one about Fulton County, Georgia, where they go after one of the attorneys for Donald Trump who showed a video, and they said, and this video made it appear falsely that they were pulling suitcases out and counting ballots from suitcases. Well, I've seen that video, and whatever quote context they say there is, there's a person who pulls a suitcase out from under a table and starts counting ballots. Now, again, I don't know how you explain that away. They just sort of dismiss it as, oh, well, you didn't show the whole video.
Yeah. Well, I remember instances of videos, it's all on video, of ballot stuffing in
Yes.
Georgia and elsewhere. People pull up, they go to the ballot box, they have a fistful of ballots that they fan out, and they take a picture of them because obviously they're getting paid for each
Paid.
ballot they
Yes.
deposit in the box. And Bill Barr, confronted with one of those videos, you know what he said? He said, "That's difficult to explain." Oh, really?
Oh,
Well,
really?
difficult to explain. Yeah, how about impossible to explain as anything other than cheating in an election? At the very
It's like
least,
if
by running around collecting ballots that wouldn't have been cast otherwise.
Well, it's like if a teacher catches a kid copying the answers from the answer key onto their test and brings them into the principal, and the principal says, "Oh, that's difficult to explain."
Well, hey,
Well,
here we go. Now he's under 3 indictments. It's probably going to be a fourth out of Georgia.
so
So,
to wrap this up, what do you think's the end game here? What do you think's going? What's your prediction? What do you think's going to happen to Trump? What do you think they're trying to do? Where do you think this leads over the next
well,
year and a half?
as an exercise in adequate conceivability, which was otherwise called
Right.
modal thinking,
Right.
try to construct a series of conceptions leading to something that seems conceivable in thought. I cannot conceive of any outcome where any judge is going to put the former president of the United States behind bars before this
Mm,
election, or in handcuffs, or restrict his ability to travel, or even take away his passport, or put an ankle
mm,
bracelet on him for monitoring. Not even this
yeah.
partisan judge in Washington, D.C., who's going to be handling this indictment. So if he can stay out of jail before the election, it's a simple matter for him, and legal scholars agree. The president can pardon himself as to the federal offenses. Now, there'll be that cockamamie indictment out of Georgia. They're going to charge Trump with RICO because he questioned the outcome of an election in Georgia. And I think that will make its way to the Supreme Court, and it will suffer the same fate as the 8-zip reversal of Jack Smith in his Governor McDonald conviction. His theory in that case was so ridiculously broad that basically every politician could be indicted for um, failure to provide honest services. So I think in the end, this is all going to come to nothing. That's my thought, meaning
Mm,
that he won't end up in jail.
right.
He might even get convicted of something, and that conviction might be upheld on the federal level, or it might be upheld as to a state court. Well, if it's upheld in a state court and the judge wants to sentence Trump to prison and he's already been elected president, that's going to present an interesting scenario.
Right.
I mean, there's already been one civil war in this country in which 700,000 people died. Who knows what will happen?
Well, and again, there you have it. The comparison of church and state couldn't be sort of more clear. People that call out the nefarious actors behind the scenes are the ones who they go after. Which again, Donald Trump, for all of his scars and warts and problems, is at least that's what he has been doing for the past 6 7 years.
Yeah, and the people who charge Trump now, led by Jack Smith, accusing him of interfering with the functions of government, are the very ones who are interfering with the functions of government in totally unprecedented ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, as you said, the only real solution here is Message of Our Lady of Fatima. The first Saturday of August coming up soon. Honor her request for the 5 first Saturdays. Say the Rosary every day. They're the things that we can do as the world, church, and state crumble around us.
And remember that we're in a stage now where things are coming to a head. There has to be a change, a radical change in the opposite direction. And the only thing we have to worry about is what's going to be left of our civilization when that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there you have that uplifting news from church and state.
More good news.
Good to see you back, Chris, and we'll hopefully see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. God bless.